The courthouse was never quiet, not really. Even when voices hushed and footsteps softened against the polished marble floor, the weight of justice seemed to hum through the air. On that morning, however, the silence felt different, thicker, more suffocating, as if the very walls of the room were aware of the gravity of the case about to unfold. Inside Courtroom 3, the atmosphere was unlike any ordinary trial. The air was heavy with expectation, the sort that settles deep into the bones of everyone present. Lawyers whispered to one another in clipped tones, flipping through files with hands that seemed steadier than they actually were. Each page turned was more than just paper. It was evidence, arguments, fragments of truth they hoped to weave into something convincing. The jury sat in their box, 12 pairs of eyes fixed on the judge's bench, though none of them seemed truly at ease. Some shifted in their seats, others folded their arms tightly, as though bracing themselves for what was to come. A few had already heard rumors in the hallways, whispers exchanged between clerks and bailiffs. A child witness. It wasn't unheard of, but the rarity of it hung over the room like a cloud. A 3-year-old was about to be asked to step into a world she could not possibly understand, a world of law, testimony, and justice. The judge, a man seasoned by decades on the bench, adjusted his glasses as he surveyed the courtroom. He had presided over cases of every shape and kind: murders, thefts, fraud, custody battles, but even he felt a weight pressing against him this morning. He knew children in court were unpredictable. Some froze, too scared to speak. Others cried uncontrollably, their words trapped behind fear. But there were also those rare, remarkable moments when a child's honesty cut through the complexities of law with the clarity only innocence could bring. He wasn't sure which outcome this day would deliver. At the prosecution's table, an attorney with tired eyes glanced at the door every few seconds, as if willing it to open. He had built his case meticulously, relying on evidence, testimony, and reports, but everything rested on the tiny shoulders of the girl who would soon enter. Without her, there were gaps the defense could exploit. With her, there was a chance for undeniable truth. He straightened his tie, though it had been perfectly straight for the past hour, and whispered to his co-counsel, "She'll be okay. She has to be." The defense attorney, sitting across the aisle, wore a mask of confidence. He tapped his pen on the desk, rhythm steady, but his eyes betrayed his calculation. He wasn't heartless, few could be when a child was involved, but he was determined. It was his job to protect his client, to cast doubt wherever possible, to question everything, even the words of a toddler. He knew the jury would listen differently to a child, with sympathy and patience, but he also knew they would question credibility. A 3-year-old's memory could be fragile. A 3-year-old's testimony could be influenced. He was ready to strike at those weaknesses the moment they appeared. The bailiff stood near the double doors, posture rigid, expression neutral, but his eyes softened whenever the thought of the child came to mind. He had escorted countless witnesses in and out of courtrooms, but this would be the first time he would lead someone so small, so vulnerable, into the intimidating space. He rehearsed in his mind how he would bend down, offer a reassuring smile, maybe even say a few gentle words to ease the fear. He understood that sometimes the smallest gestures could mean the most. And then there were the onlookers, the reporters in the back rows, pens poised over notepads, eager to capture every detail of the case that had already stirred public attention. Their presence only heightened the tension. They were not allowed to photograph or record, but their words would carry the story to the world outside, shaping public opinion before the verdict was even reached. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but it did little to cut through the heat that seemed to rise from the bodies packed inside the room. A cough from one corner broke the silence for a brief moment, quickly followed by an awkward shuffle of papers, as though everyone needed to pretend they weren't waiting, weren't anxious, once silently wondering how a child so young could possibly stand as a witness. At exactly 9 o'clock, the judge struck his gavel once, the sound echoing sharply through the chamber. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice firm but not unkind. The attorneys rose, the jury straightened, and all attention locked on the bench. Formalities passed quickly, the calling of the case, the confirmation of appearances, but beneath it all, every word seemed to drag. They were all moving toward the inevitable moment, the moment when the doors at the back of the room would open, and the child would appear. The judge paused, glancing once more at the prosecution's table. His voice softened slightly as he said, "We are prepared to hear testimony from the minor witness. Please proceed when ready." A ripple of movement swept through the room. The prosecution nodded, and the bailiff straightened, hand on the door. Time seemed to slow. The jurors leaned forward, the reporters gripped their pens tighter, and the defense lawyer sat back with measured calm. The air grew heavier still, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Behind the closed doors, a small figure waited with a social worker. She clutched a stuffed toy, though it would have to stay outside, and her wide eyes darted nervously as the murmur of voices seeped through the wooden panels. She didn't know what a jury was, or why so many adults were gathered in one place. She only knew that people had told her she was safe, that there was a nice dog waiting inside, and that she just had to be brave. Inside the courtroom, however, no one knew what would happen when those doors opened. Would she speak? Would she crumble? Would the truth come out? Or would fear win the day? The bailiff glanced toward the judge, who gave a subtle nod. With one practiced motion, he reached for the handle. The faint creak of the hinges sounded louder than thunder in the stillness of the room. Every head turned. Every heartbeat seemed to thud louder, and then the door began to open. The courtroom, filled with grown men and women hardened by years of legal battles, felt as fragile as glass. No one dared move. They knew this was not just the beginning of testimony. It was the beginning of something no one would ever forget. Yasa. The courtroom door opened slowly, and the sound of the hinges drew every gaze like a magnet. For a moment, the light from the hallway spilled in, a faint glow that seemed almost too gentle for the heavy, serious space it entered. And then, stepping hesitantly across the threshold, came the figure everyone had been waiting for. She was impossibly small. The 3-year-old girl looked more like she belonged in a playground than in a courthouse. Her steps careful, her head slightly bowed, as if the weight of so many watching eyes pressed down on her. Her tiny shoes squeaked faintly against the polished floor, the noise echoing far louder than it should have, each step marking her fragile journey into a world she could not possibly understand. At her side walked a social worker, a woman who had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. She leaned down slightly, her hand gently holding the girl's, whispering encouragement with each hesitant step. "You're okay. You're safe. Just keep walking." The words were soft, nearly drowned by the silence of the room, but they were enough to guide the child forward. The girl's eyes lifted, wide and searching. From her perspective, the courtroom was a cavern, walls rising higher than she could. Imagine rows of strangers staring silently. Their expressions, though not unkind, were intimidating. Some were stern, some unreadable, and a few softened with sympathy. But to a child, they all seemed enormous, like figures from a storybook where giants towered above the tiny. Her hair was pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, strands escaping to frame her round face. The bow on one side had already begun to droop, evidence of nervous hands tugging at it in the waiting room. Her small dress, chosen carefully by her foster caregiver that morning, was simple but neat, a splash of pale yellow meant to bring cheer into an otherwise heavy day. It swayed lightly as she moved, but the fabric couldn't hide the tension. In her small body, The social worker guided her toward the front, past the rows of benches where strangers sat shoulder to shoulder. Some jurors leaned forward, their gazes softening as they saw the child. Others exchanged quick glances, perhaps silently questioning how someone so young could play such a critical role in the outcome of a trial. The reporters in the back scribbled furiously, though their pens trembled slightly. This was not a scene to be written lightly. The judge, watching from his elevated bench, felt something shift within him as the child approached. Decades of presiding over trials had steeled him to many things: grief, anger, injustice. But the sight of a toddler walking into a courtroom pierced through every layer of detachment he had built. His stern expression softened, and though he did not speak yet, his eyes carried an unspoken message: "You are not here alone." At the prosecution's table, the attorney's breath caught in his throat. He had seen victims and witnesses of all ages, but watching this little girl step forward reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place. Justice was not always about grand speeches or dramatic evidence. Sometimes it was about giving a voice to those who barely had one. He silently willed her strength, knowing the entire case rested on her ability to utter even a few words. Across the aisle, the defense attorney observed carefully, pen tapping lightly against his pad. He was unmoved outwardly, his expression professional, but his mind raced. He knew the jury's hearts were already bending toward the child. Sympathy was a powerful force, one that could cloud judgment. He had to remain vigilant, to remind the court when the time came that testimony from someone so young could not be taken without scrutiny. Still, a flicker of unease brushed across his thoughts. How do you cross-examine innocence? The girl's steps slowed as she neared the front. Her hand tightened around the social worker's, and for a moment, she stopped completely. The weight of the room bore down on her, and she shrank slightly behind the woman guiding her. The social worker bent low, whispering again, brushing a reassuring hand over the child's shoulder. The encouragement worked. After a pause, the little girl nodded once, a tiny, brave movement, and took another step forward. The bailiff, standing close by, crouched slightly so his towering frame would not overwhelm her. His voice, usually commanding and firm, softened into something warm. "You're doing great," he murmured. The girl's eyes flicked up at him, unsure, but then back down to the floor. She didn't answer, but she moved again, inch by inch toward the witness stand. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath, even the scratching of reporters. Pens had stilled. The air was thick, every second stretching into what felt like minutes as the child's journey continued. When she finally reached the small step leading up to the witness chair, she hesitated again. The seat, designed for adults, looked impossibly high to her. Her small body tensed, unsure if she could climb it. The bailiff moved to help, but before he could, the judge raised a hand subtly, signaling patience. This moment belonged to her. She needed to do it in her own time. After a brief struggle of courage versus fear, the child reached up, clutching the edge of the chair. With the social worker's gentle lift, she climbed into the seat, her legs dangling far above the floor. She shifted nervously, hands fidgeting in her lap, eyes darting toward the rows of strangers who continued to watch. To ease her tension, the bailiff approached with a small cushion, a gesture prepared in advance for this very moment. He placed it behind her back, helping her sit more comfortably. For the first time since entering, her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, brief but genuine. The judge leaned forward, his voice calm, almost grandfatherly. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said. The words, though simple, carried warmth that spread through the room. "You're very brave to be here today." The girl didn't respond. Not yet. She glanced at the judge, then quickly back at her lap. But her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly at his tone. And then it happened her eyes wandered to the side of the stand, where a golden retriever sat quietly, its tail resting still on the floor. The therapy K9, trained for exactly this role, lifted its head and blinked at her with calm, patient eyes. No sound, no movement, just presence. The little girl's lips parted in a small breath. Her eyes fixed on the dog, and for a moment, the sea of adults, the towering walls, and the intimidating weight of the courtroom all seemed to fade. The social worker noticed the shift instantly. "Do you see the friend we talked about?" she whispered gently. The girl nodded, her gaze still on the retriever. A flicker of calm washed over her face, fragile but undeniable. The courtroom remained silent, but something unspoken passed through it. The child was here. She had arrived. And though fear lingered, a glimmer of courage now walked beside her four paws, a steady heartbeat, and the promise of safety. No one knew yet what words she would share, or if her voice would carry the truth the court needed. But in that moment, her arrival itself felt monumental. The smallest witness had taken her place, and the story of the trial had truly begun. The little girl sat perched in the oversized witness chair, her legs dangling far above the polished floor. The courtroom loomed around her rows of solemn faces, the elevated judge's bench, the opposing tables stacked with thick folders and neat lines of pens. To her, it was not a place of justice, but a cavern of strangers, every pair of eyes too heavy, too sharp, too curious. And then she saw him, at the foot of the stand, lying on a soft mat, as if the entire room were his living room, was a golden retriever. His fur shimmered under the faint light of the overhead lamps, golden waves that seemed warmer than anything else in the cold, formal chamber. His head rested gently on his paws, eyes half-lidded in calm patience. The dog did not move when she looked at him. He didn't wag, didn't bark, didn't beg for attention. He simply was. The child's breath stilled in her chest. Her gaze locked on the retriever, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, her eyes stopped darting from face to face in anxious search. The sight of him was an anchor, pulling her out of the storm. The judge leaned back slightly, observing with care. Therapy animals had only recently been allowed in his courtroom, a decision met with mixed opinions. Some had argued it was unprofessional, even manipulative. But watching the way the child's trembling shoulders stilled, the moment her eyes met the retriever's, the judge knew he had made the right choice. This was not manipulation. This was mercy. The bailiff, standing tall near the door, smiled faintly. He had been part of the small circle that had argued for the K9's presence today. He had seen firsthand the difference these dogs made with children who carried burdens too heavy for their years. Still, even he was moved by the silent magic unfolding before him. The golden retriever blinked once, slow and deliberate, and lifted his head slightly, as though acknowledging the child without asking for more. The little girl tilted her head in response, her lips parting just slightly in wonder. The courtroom, full of adults, faded to the edges of her mind. The dog became her center. At the prosecution's table, the lead attorney exhaled in relief. He had been nervous about how the girl would react, whether the fear would overwhelm her before she even had the chance to speak. Now, watching her fix her gaze on the retriever, he knew the odds had shifted in their favor. "Good boy," he whispered under his breath, though the dog could not hear him. The defense attorney, on the other hand, stiffened slightly. He wasn't heartless. He loved animals himself. But he knew the power of that dog was beyond measure in this setting. Jurors were human, not machines. Watching a frightened child draw courage from a dog's presence was something they could never ignore. This, he thought grimly, is the kind of detail that sways hearts, not just minds. The girl shifted in her seat, her small hands still fidgeting. In her lap, Her eyes, though, never left the retriever. The social worker beside her leaned down and whispered softly, "Remember what we said? If you feel scared, you can look at him. He's here just for you." The little girl nodded, almost imperceptibly. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, she murmured, "Doggy." The word floated through the courtroom, soft yet powerful. A few jurors smiled despite themselves. One wiped at her eyes quickly, as though embarrassed by her reaction. The golden retriever's ears flicked at the sound, but he remained perfectly still, trained to be a steady presence, not a distraction. His stillness was intentional, a discipline, honed through months of training. This wasn't playtime, it was purpose. The judge leaned forward, resting his chin on one hand. "That's right," he said gently, his voice directed toward the child, but loud enough for the jury to hear. "That's our special helper. He's here to make sure you feel safe." The girl's lips trembled, torn between fear and the faintest trace of a smile. She peeked at the judge, then back at the retriever, and finally whispered again, this time a little clearer, "Safe, dog." The room shifted. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a declaration. Those two words carried more power than anyone expected. The jury collectively leaned back, struck by the simplicity of it. Reporters' pens scratched wildly as they captured the phrase, knowing it would headline every article. The prosecution felt their case grow stronger, while the defense felt the jury's empathy slip further from their grasp. The golden retriever lifted his head fully now, his gaze meeting the little girl's with calm assurance. His tail gave a single, slow wag, as if to confirm what she had just said. "Yes, safe." The social worker squeezed the child's hand, whispering, "You're very brave." Encouraged, the girl settled into the chair, her body relaxing fractionally. The retriever laid his head back down, satisfied, his role performed without a sound. He didn't need words. His presence was enough. For the jurors, the moment was unforgettable. They would later recount it during deliberations, not because it proved facts, but because it revealed truth. Truth about the child's fear, truth about her need for protection, truth about the environment in which she found strength to speak. The judge made a note to himself, though he knew he would never forget this morning. He had presided over countless trials, but this was different. Justice, he realized, wasn't only about laws and verdicts. Sometimes it was about compassion, about creating a space where even the smallest voice could be heard. The little girl, still gazing at the dog, drew in a shaky breath. She was not yet ready to answer the questions that would come, but the seed of courage had been planted. The retriever, silent and steadfast, would water it with his presence. The defense lawyer shifted in his chair, recognizing the uphill climb. Ahead, no cross-examination strategy could erase the impact of that moment. The phrase "safe dog" would echo in the jury's minds long after evidence was weighed. He scribbled notes furiously, but deep down, he knew the trial had tilted in a way no legal tactic could fully counter. In the back of the room, the reporters exchanged knowing glances. They had come expecting drama, perhaps even tragedy. Instead, they witnessed something rare: purity breaking through the rigidity of the law. One whispered to another, "That's the story, right there." The child leaned a little closer toward the retriever, her body less rigid now. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, was quiet but steady. "I can do it." The words were not meant for the lawyers, nor the jury, nor even the judge. They were meant for herself, whispered into the silence, anchored by the steady presence at her feet. The courtroom exhaled, though no one said a word. In that sacred pause, everyone knew. The testimony ahead would not be easy, but it would be possible. And that was enough. The golden retriever closed his eyes once more, tail brushing the floor with a soft thump. His job was far from done, but he had already accomplished something monumental. He had turned fear into courage. He had transformed silence into the possibility of truth. And in the stillness that followed, the entire courtroom understood the power of a single presence, calm, patient, unwavering. The presence of the K9. The little girl sat in the oversized witness chair, her body looking even smaller against the tall wooden backrest. Her legs dangled freely, far from touching the floor, her shoes swinging slightly with nervous energy, though the cushion behind her gave some comfort. The courtroom itself felt overwhelming. Her small fingers twisted at the hem of her dress. She didn't look at the judge, the jury, or the lawyers. Her eyes kept drifting down toward her lap, as if the fabric of her yellow dress could shield her from the weight of the room. Once in a while, she glanced at the golden retriever by her side, the safe dog, before quickly lowering her gaze again. The silence stretched. The jury waited. The judge watched with patience, though even he could feel the tension curling tighter with each passing second. The social worker leaned close, whispering softly, "You're okay. Just remember, you don't have to be scared. Everyone here just wants to listen to you." But the child didn't respond. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but no sound came out. She shrank back into the chair, pulling her knees up slightly, her entire posture folding inward. It was the moment the entire courtroom had feared: hesitation. Children, especially one so young, often froze when faced with such an environment. The law had its structure, its traditions, its rules, but none of those mattered to a 3-year-old, whose world was defined by comfort and fear, by safety and danger. The judge cleared his throat gently, his voice soft. "It's all right, sweetheart. We're in no rush." He leaned forward slightly, abandoning the formality he usually carried. His tone was grandfatherly, warm. "Do you see that dog down there? He's here just for you. You don't even need to look at me if you don't want to. You can look at him instead." The girl's eyes flicked toward the golden retriever. The dog had not moved, had not even lifted his head this time. He lay on the mat with his chest rising and falling in calm rhythm, a living reminder that not everything in the room was frightening. But the child's fear was still heavy. Her gaze darted to the rows of strangers, again the jury box, the benches filled with observers, the lawyers with their serious faces. It was too much. Her lip trembled, and she tucked her chin closer to her chest. The prosecution attorney's chest tightened. He had prepared every legal argument, every witness, every exhibit, but this fragile moment was beyond preparation. If she couldn't speak, the entire case risked unraveling. He cast a quick glance at the dog, silently willing it to work its quiet magic again. The defense attorney, meanwhile, scribbled a note onto his pad. He masked his expression carefully, but inside, his mind was racing. Hesitation meant doubt, and doubt was his greatest ally. If the child could not find her voice, the jury might question everything. He reminded himself to remain still, not to appear as though he relished her fear. The jury would not forgive cruelty. He needed to seem sympathetic, even while calculating. The bailiff shifted near the door, his face neutral, but his thoughts tender. He had children of his own. Watching the girl struggle stirred something deep within him. He wanted to step forward, to tell her she didn't have to be afraid, that none of these people would hurt her, but that wasn't his role. His job was to protect, yes, but from the sidelines, unseen unless needed. The little girl's hands clutched tightly at the fabric in her lap. She looked down, then sideways, then back to the dog. Finally, in a whisper that barely reached the social worker's ear, she murmured, "Too many people." The words were so faint that only those nearest her heard them. The social worker repeated gently, "She says it feels like too many people, Your Honor." A ripple passed through the room. Some jurors softened visibly. Others frowned in concern. The judge nodded slowly, his gaze settling on the child. "That's very brave of you to say," he told her kindly. "You're right, there are a lot of people here. But remember, they're only listening. They won't talk to you or bother you. You can think of them as statues, if that helps. They're just sitting and watching, not doing anything at all." The girl peeked at the jury again. The comparison seemed to help a little. Statues were less scary than strangers. She studied them with wide eyes, then quickly looked back down at her lap. The silence stretched again. The child's shoulders rose and fell quickly with each breath. She was fighting an invisible battle: fear versus courage, silence versus voice. And then, as if sensing the struggle, the retriever moved. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his head so that it rested closer to the girl's chair. His eyes lifted to hers, calm and unwavering. His tail brushed the floor once, a soft thump that echoed louder in her mind than in the room. The girl's breath steadied. Her hands unclenched slightly, releasing the tight grip on her dress. She whispered again, louder this time. "Safe. Dog." The words carried through the courtroom, audible to everyone. And with them came a visible shift. The jury exhaled collectively. The prosecution smiled faintly in relief. Even the judge's stern face softened further. But still, the hesitation lingered. The social worker leaned closer, her tone soothing. "Would you like to hold my hand while you talk?" The girl nodded, her tiny fingers reaching for the adult's steady palm. She grasped it tightly, as though anchoring herself. She looked at the retriever again, then at the judge. Her lips parted, then closed. Fear and courage still wrestled inside her. The defense attorney leaned forward slightly, pen hovering. Every pause, every silence, was a point he could use later to argue unreliability. Yet even he couldn't deny the effect the dog had. Without the animal's presence, the girl might not have uttered a single word at all. The judge gave her time. He did not rush, did not press. He allowed the silence to remain, heavy though it was. Finally, in a voice, trembling but audible, the girl whispered, "I don't want to talk." The words hung in the air, fragile and final. The jury looked at one another, uncertain. The prosecution's stomach dropped. The defense's pen scratched furiously across the paper. But then the retriever's tail tapped again, once, twice, steady like a heartbeat. The girl looked down at him, her lips trembling. She repeated herself softer, as if clarifying for the dog. "I don't want to talk, but I can." The shift was immediate. The judge's eyes warmed. The prosecution straightened with hope. The defense froze mid-note. The hesitation was still there, thick, palpable, but for the first time, courage peeked through. The little girl leaned forward slightly, still clutching the social worker's hand. Her eyes were still fearful, her voice still small, but she had declared something monumental. Not that she couldn't, but that she could. The courtroom did not erupt in applause. Of course, it remained silent, respectful, but the atmosphere had changed. The jurors leaned in, ready. The attorneys sharpened their focus. The judge gave a small nod, his expression one of quiet encouragement. The child had hesitated, had nearly crumbled under the weight of it all. But with the safe dog at her side, she had chosen to fight through. And that choice would change everything. The courtroom had been holding its breath for what felt like an eternity. Silence stretched from wall to wall, pressing down on every person in the chamber. The little girl sat frozen in the witness chair, her tiny hand clenched tightly around. The social workers. Her chest rose and fell in short, shallow breaths, the kind that betrayed a heart beating too fast for such a small body. Every eye in the room was on her. The jury leaned forward, barely blinking. afraid that even the faintest movement might shatter the fragile courage being built. The prosecution sat still as stone, praying silently that the child's voice would find its way through the fear. The defense, though careful not to show it, watched with intense calculation, pen hovering above paper, ready to capture every hesitation, every stumble, every uncertainty. The judge, however, did not look at her like a lawyer or a strategist. His gaze was softer, more human. He had seen hardened criminals, lying witnesses, manipulative testimonies, but he had never seen a child this young asked to shoulder the weight of truth in such a setting. His expression, though dignified, carried something else: compassion. And then, without warning, the girl's head lifted. Her wide eyes no longer darted nervously around the room. Instead, they locked on the golden retriever lying quietly at the base of the stand. The dog had not moved much since she sat down, his breathing steady, his body still. But to the girl, he was the only familiar thing in a sea of strangeness. Her lips parted. At first, no sound came. Then, in the smallest of whispers, she spoke. "Safe, dog." The words were so soft, they seemed to vanish into the air the moment they were spoken. For a heartbeat, no one reacted, perhaps because no one was certain they had actually heard them. But then the meaning sank in, and the room shifted. Gasps escaped from the back rows. A juror's eyes widened, her hand rising involuntarily to her mouth. The court reporter, who had been typing mechanically until now, paused with her fingers suspended over the keys. Even the bailiff, usually a statue of formality, blinked and straightened in surprise. The judge leaned forward, his face softening. Those two words, so simple, so childlike, were more profound than any testimony he had ever heard. Not because they proved the case, not because they revealed evidence, but because they cut through the tension with purity. In that moment, the entire courtroom had seen what safety meant to a child. It was not laws or titles or rituals. It was trust. It was a dog. The little girl, emboldened by the stillness that followed, repeated herself, this time louder. She pointed with her tiny finger toward the retriever, her eyes wide but steady. Safe dog. This time, the words echoed. The jury collectively leaned back in their seats, some exchanging glances with tears brimming in their eyes. The prosecution felt the knot in their chest unravel. And the defense, though outwardly calm, knew the jury would never forget those two words. The dog, as if acknowledging her declaration, lifted his head fully now. His brown eyes met hers with calm assurance, and his tail wagged once, slow and steady. It wasn't a playful wag. It was measured, intentional, as though he understood that his presence had been called upon, named, and cherished. The girl's posture shifted. Her shoulders, once hunched in fear, straightened slightly. Her grip on the social worker's hand loosened, just a little. The trembling in her legs stopped, all because of two words and the presence of the animal beside her. The judge let the silence linger, honoring the moment. He could feel the weight of it, not just for the trial, but for the people in the room who would carry this story beyond the courthouse walls. This wasn't just testimony. It was transformation. Finally, he cleared his throat gently and said, "That's right. He's a safe dog. He's here for you." The girl looked up at the judge. Her fear didn't vanish entirely, but in its place was something new. Trust. She nodded once, firmly, as though the acknowledgement from the highest seat in the room had sealed her courage. The social worker squeezed her hand, whispering, "You did so good." The prosecution attorney allowed himself to breathe for the first time in minutes. He didn't smile. He didn't want to appear as though he was exploiting the moment. But inside, he felt relief flood through him. The child had spoken. She had found her voice. And that meant there was hope. The defense attorney scribbled something quickly on his notepad, though he knew no amount of words could erase what had just happened. He reminded himself that sympathy was not the same as evidence. Still, he couldn't deny it. Those two words would resonate with the jury long after his cross-examination. In the gallery, a reporter mouthed the phrase to herself, already imagining the headline, "Safe Dog," the words that stopped the courtroom. The girl, still pointing at the retriever, seemed to gather strength from the acknowledgement. She lowered her hand, took a deep breath, and whispered, "I can talk now." The courtroom froze again, but this time it wasn't with dread, it was with awe. The very thing everyone had feared, that the child would remain silent, too frightened to testify, had shifted. She had declared her readiness, in her own way, on her own terms. The judge nodded once more, his voice kind. "Take your time, little one. We're listening." The retriever settled back down, his head resting once again on his paws, but his tail flicked against the floor in a rhythm that matched the steadying of the girl's breaths. The transformation was undeniable. The child who had entered the courtroom moments earlier as a trembling, silent figure now sat taller, anchored by the trust she had found in the safe dog. The hesitation hadn't vanished, but it had been pierced by courage. And though the trial would continue, with questions, answers, and challenges to come, the defining moment had already occurred. A 3-year-old had lifted her hand, pointed at a dog, and spoken 2 words that carried more power than any argument, any cross-examination, any piece of evidence. Safe dog. It was unexpected. It was pure. It was unforgettable. And it left the judge, along with everyone else in that courtroom, utterly speechless. The words still hung in the air, echoing long after the little girl had spoken them. Safe dog. The phrase lingered like a bell that refused to stop ringing, reverberating in the ears and hearts of everyone in the courtroom. 2 words, simple and childlike, had reshaped the atmosphere entirely. It was as if the heavy stone walls had shifted, as though the air itself had softened. The judge leaned back slowly in his chair, his hands folded before him. He was not a man easily rattled. Decades of trials had weathered his composure. Yet even he felt a quiet tremor beneath his stern exterior. The law was about facts, evidence, and testimony. But what the child had given them was something deeper. A glimpse of innocence, fragile but unbroken, that spoke louder than anything in the thick case files before him. The jury, too, was visibly altered. Some leaned forward, their expressions tender, their eyes brimming with empathy. Others sat back, stunned into stillness. One juror, a woman who had been stony and unreadable for days, now had tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She dabbed them quickly with a tissue, embarrassed, but it was too late. Everyone around her had seen. The prosecution attorney shifted in his seat, his chest rising with a breath that carried relief and renewed resolve. For days he had carried the weight of the case on his shoulders, worried about whether the little girl would ever speak at all. Now, with those 2 words, she had not only spoken, she had captured the hearts of the room. He knew better than to call it victory, but it was momentum, and in trials, momentum mattered. The defense attorney, on the other hand, felt the tide turning against him. His pen hovered above his legal pad, then scratched a quick note, though he already knew the problem. He was no longer arguing against the prosecution. He was arguing against human emotion, against sympathy so raw it bordered on unshakable. Facts could be debated, logic could be dissected, but the memory of a trembling child pointing at a golden retriever and declaring him safe would live forever in the minds of those jurors. And in that realization, he shifted as well, not in defeat, but in strategy. His face remained calm, his posture still professional, but his thoughts churned. Stay composed. Find a way to reframe. Don't let sympathy become proof. He had won cases in tougher climates, but even he knew this moment would be nearly impossible to erase. The golden retriever, unaware of the ripple he had caused, simply blinked up at the little girl and rested his head back down. To him, this was no courtroom. It was just another day of work, another child who needed quiet strength. His presence was steady, unshaken, just as he had been trained. Yet to the girl, and to the jury who witnessed it, he was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a silent hero. The bailiff, watching from his post, felt something stir within him. He had stood in this room for years, enforcing silence, order, and rules. He had seen anger boil, seen lies unravel, seen guilt written plainly on faces. But this was different. He found himself gripping the edge of his belt, steadying himself, because even as a seasoned officer of the court, he felt tears threaten at the corners of his own eyes. The gallery, packed with reporters and observers, buzzed with restrained energy. Pens scratched furiously, trying to capture the weight of the moment. Cameras, though forbidden to record, clicked in the minds of every journalist present. They knew what they had witnessed was rare. Truth unadorned, innocence breaking through the formalities of law. The social worker, seated at the girl's side, leaned down and whispered, "You did so well. Everyone heard you." Her hand squeezed the child's, not in prompting, but in affirmation. The little girl, cheeks flushed and eyes wide, blinked. At her, and then back at the retriever. Her small lips pressed together, almost a smile, almost a sigh of relief. The judge finally spoke, his voice calm, deliberate. "Thank you, young lady. That was very brave." He let the compliment settle. Not rushing, not moving to the next question. He wanted the child to feel it, to know that her words mattered. And in that pause, the courtroom shifted further. What had moments ago been a chamber of tension now felt like a sanctuary of sorts. The jurors were no longer detached evaluators. They were witnesses to courage. The attorneys were no longer just adversaries. They were participants in something larger than argument. Even the judge, elevated in his chair, seemed less like an untouchable authority and more like a grandfather, watching over a child. The child herself sat a little taller now, her back no longer pressed tightly against the chair. Her grip on the social worker's hand loosened, her gaze steadier. She still leaned toward the retriever, still anchored by his presence, but she was no longer entirely hidden within her fear. The prosecution attorney, sensing the change, rose slowly. He approached the witness stand with careful steps, his demeanor gentle. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and respectful. "Can you tell us," he asked, "why the dog makes you feel safe?" The little girl's lips parted. She hesitated, her eyes darting once toward the jury, then back to the retriever. Her hand twitched nervously, but then the dog's tail brushed the floor again, a quiet reminder. "Because," she whispered, pausing as though searching for words too big for her tiny voice. "Because he doesn't leave." The courtroom fell still again. The statement, simple yet profound, carried a weight the adults could hardly process without their throats tightening. To a child who had known instability, who had likely been left in frightening situations before, the idea of someone or something who doesn't leave was more than comfort. It was salvation. The jury reacted visibly. Several jurors shifted in their seats, clearly moved. One man rubbed his chin, his eyes glistening. Another shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. They weren't just listening, they were feeling. The defense attorney scribbled furiously on his pad, though his jaw tightened. He knew he couldn't object to the child's words. What would he say? That her feelings were irrelevant? That her truth was too emotional? No, the jury would never forgive him for that. He had to sit, to wait, to plot carefully. But inside, He felt the grip of the case slipping. The judge leaned forward, his voice warm. That's a very smart answer. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. The room was already altered. The social worker brushed a strand of hair from the girl's face, her eyes shining with pride. You're doing wonderful, she whispered. The golden retriever, as if satisfied with his charge's bravery, shifted his position slightly and let out a quiet sigh before settling again. The prosecution attorney knew he could ask more, but he chose restraint. The girl had spoken clearly, bravely, powerfully. Pushing her further now might risk unraveling the fragile courage she had gathered. He stepped back, giving her space, letting her small victory settle into permanence. The judge nodded, then looked toward the jury, his expression grave, but tinged with something gentler. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard testimony today in a form rarely seen. I ask you to weigh it with the care it deserves. He didn't need to say more. The jury understood. And so, the shift became undeniable. The trial was no longer just a battle of prosecution versus defense. It was no longer merely about evidence, documents, and procedures. It was about the courage of a child, the presence of a dog, and the truth that innocence could still pierce through walls of formality. Every person in that courtroom felt it. The air itself seemed lighter. The gravity of justice had not diminished, but its tone had changed. It was no longer just a courtroom. It was a place where fear had been answered by safety, silence by voice, hesitation by courage. And the ripple of that shift would carry through every argument, every deliberation, every word that followed. The trial would go on, but nothing would ever be the same. The room had gone still again, but it was not the silence of hesitation or fear. This was different. This silence was heavy, purposeful, almost sacred. A judge sat high above the courtroom, his gavel resting untouched at his side. He had not moved for several long moments. His hands folded together, his gaze fixed on the little girl who had just pointed at the golden retriever and spoken the words that shattered the tension. Safe dog. He had presided over countless cases, from routine thefts to violent crimes, from corporate disputes to family tragedies. In his decades on the bench, he had heard polished speeches from attorneys, studied stacks of evidence, and watched juries wrestle with the burden of judgment. But he had never been rendered quite this speechless. 2 words. That was all it had taken. Not the testimony of an expert witness, not a dramatic revelation of new evidence. Just 2 words spoken by a trembling 3-year-old whose shoes couldn't even reach the floor. The judge's throat tightened as he tried to form his response. He knew he needed to speak, to guide the proceedings, to keep the trial moving forward. But something inside him resisted. For once, the law could wait. For once, silence spoke louder. The jury, sensing the weight of the pause, held still in reverence. No one shifted in their seats, no one coughed, no one dared break the stillness. Their faces reflected the same thought. They were witnessing something more profound than any legal procedure. The prosecution sat frozen, his notes forgotten on the table before him. He had envisioned this testimony for weeks, rehearsing how best to coax the child's voice out from beneath her fear. Yet now, he realized no amount of preparation could have produced this moment. It was raw, unplanned, undeniably authentic. And it carried a force greater than anything he could have scripted. The defense attorney, usually quick to object, remained silent as well. He tapped his pen against the yellow pad, his lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to find words in objection, a reframing, anything that could cut through the emotional tide, but even he knew it would be futile. To interrupt now would not only fail but backfire. He sat still, reminding himself that silence was sometimes strategy. But in truth, his silence was born not of calculation, but of awe. The bailiff, positioned by the door, watched the judge with keen eyes. He had worked alongside him for years, had seen him handle outbursts, arguments, and the occasional emotional collapse. But this was different. The bailiff realized the judge wasn't just managing the courtroom, he was absorbing it. And in the center of it all sat the little girl. Her small hand rested on the social worker's, her eyes glued to the retriever below. The dog hadn't moved much, only his tail swished once, steady and grounding, but for the child, it was enough. She didn't understand the weight of her words, didn't realize how deeply they had cut through the courtroom's walls. To her, she had only said the truth. He was a safe dog. The social worker bent close and whispered, "You're so brave." The girl blinked, her gaze still locked on the retriever. She whispered back, almost as if telling a secret, "He listens." The social worker felt her throat close. She nodded gently, squeezing the little hand tighter. The judge exhaled slowly, breaking the silence at last. His voice, when it came, was softer than usual, stripped of its commanding edge. "Thank you," he said simply. His eyes flickered from the child to the dog and back again. "You've reminded this courtroom what truth sounds like." It wasn't the kind of statement judges usually made. It wasn't procedural, nor was it even strictly necessary. But the jury needed to hear it. The attorneys needed to hear it. And perhaps, most of all, he needed to hear himself say it. The court reporter's fingers finally moved again, clicking against the keys, though even she had tears in her eyes. She typed the judge's words carefully, knowing they would live on in the transcript. The prosecution attorney stood slowly, his posture unusually tentative. He cleared his throat and spoke with gentleness that matched the tone of the room. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to ask the witness only one more question for today." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The attorney approached the stand cautiously, as though afraid of disturbing the fragile balance. That had settled. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to eye level with the child. His voice was calm, careful. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "do you feel safer because the dog is here with you?" The girl nodded without hesitation. "Yes." "Do you think you can tell us what you need to say?" "Because he's here?" Her lips trembled, but then she gave another tiny nod. "Yes, he helps me be brave." The jury reacted visibly. Several members leaned forward, their hands clasped, their faces softened by emotion. The prosecution thanked her gently, then stepped back, resisting the urge to push further. The defense attorney rose as if to object, but his lips parted, then closed again. He sat back down without a word, his pen tapping once before going still. The judge let the silence return. Not oppressive silence this time, but contemplative. He felt the courtroom breathing in unison, every heart anchored by the words of a child and the quiet presence of a dog. Finally, he spoke again, his tone deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady, but softer than his usual cadence. "I remind you that your duty is to weigh evidence carefully, without prejudice or undue influence. But I also remind you," he paused, his gaze lingering on the child, "that evidence takes many forms. Sometimes it is found in documents. Sometimes it is heard in testimony. And sometimes it is seen in courage." The jurors absorbed his words in silence, their faces solemn. The judge turned back to the little girl. His stern features softened further, and for a moment, he looked less like a judge and more like a grandfather. "You've done enough for today," he said gently. "More than enough. You may rest now." The social worker whispered praise into the child's ear, guiding her slowly from the stand. The retriever stood at once, matching her steps, walking by her side as though tethered to her courage. His gait was calm, steady, protective. The jury followed her with their eyes until she disappeared from view. And when the door closed behind her, the silence deepened once more. The judge remained still, his gavel untouched, his hands folded. His eyes swept the room, the attorneys, the jury, the gallery, the bailiff, and finally, he exhaled. "This court," he said quietly, almost reverently, "will recess until tomorrow morning." He rose from his chair, his robe sweeping as he stepped down. For the first time in years, he walked away from the bench, not with the weight of the law pressing on his shoulders, but with the echo of two small words following him out the door. Safe dog. It was not law, it was not evidence, but it was truth. And in his silence, the judge had honored it. The courtroom was quiet the next morning when the proceedings resumed. Yet it was not the same silence that had hung heavy in the days before. This silence was different, less brittle, less suffocating. It was a silence born of reflection. Every person who stepped into the chamber carried with them the memory of the day before, the little girl's trembling voice, the small finger pointing toward the golden retriever, and the words that had melted the hardest walls of formality. Safe dog. The jury filed in with measured steps. Their eyes were brighter, more attentive. They carried the unspoken bond of people who had witnessed something extraordinary together. Whatever verdict they would one day reach, they knew this case would never leave them. The prosecution attorney sat straighter than he had all week. His notes, usually scattered and dog-eared, lay neatly stacked in front of him. He had spent the night replaying the girl's words in his mind, wondering if he could ever deliver an argument as powerful as her simple truth. The answer was no, but perhaps he didn't need to. The child had already spoken more than enough. The defense attorney arrived quietly, his briefcase snapping shut with more force than usual. He carried himself with the poise of a professional. But inside, he knew the battle had shifted irreversibly. He could challenge facts, question reliability, and argue the standards of proof, but he could not erase what the jury had felt. He had seen their faces. He knew their hearts had been touched, and hearts rarely forgot. The bailiff returned to his post, his uniform crisp, his stance straight. Yet when his eyes drifted toward the empty witness stand, he felt something stir deep inside him again. He thought of his own daughter at home, barely older than the little girl, and how her small words could move him without warning. He had sworn an oath to protect the order of the court, but yesterday reminded him that justice was not just rules, it was humanity. And then, at last, the judge entered. The courtroom rose, as always, in respect. He took his seat at the bench, his expression composed, his hands steady. Yet those who looked closely saw it, the faint softness around his eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before he began. He carried yesterday with him too. He cleared his throat. This court will resume proceedings in the matter of... His voice trailed into formality, into the rhythm of law. But underneath, the memory of a child's words hummed like an unshakable echo. The golden retriever lay once more at the side of the room, though today the little girl was not present. She had done her part. Her testimony, brief as it was, had changed the course of the trial. Now the attorneys would argue, the evidence would be reviewed, and the jury would deliberate. The dog simply rested, his eyes half closed, as though he knew his most important task was already complete. As the trial moved forward, the girl's words were not repeated aloud in every question or answer, but they hovered invisibly in the air. The jury remembered them. The attorneys measured their strategies against them. Even the judge's rulings seemed tinged with the memory. By the time the trial drew to a close days later, the verdict mattered, yes, but something else lingered. Even stronger, the reminder that truth did not always arrive dressed in legal language. Sometimes it came wrapped in innocence, trembling but unbroken. When the jury was dismissed and the attorneys packed their bags, the story of the little girl and the retriever had already begun to ripple outward. Reporters whispered about it in hallways. Clerks repeated it to friends over coffee. Even the bailiff told his wife that night, his voice cracking as he said, "You should have heard her." Just 2 words, but it was like the whole world stopped. The judge, usually private with his reflections, carried the moment with him in silence. Long after the trial ended, he would sit alone in his chambers, staring at the wooden grain of his desk, and hear her voice again. He would recall the way the room had changed, the way hardened jurors had softened, the way silence had become reverence. He knew he had presided over justice that day, not because the law had been perfectly followed, but because truth had found its way through fear. For the little girl, the memory was different. She did not remember the grandeur of the courtroom, or the stern figure of the judge, or the rows of strangers watching her. What she remembered was the golden retriever lying by her side. She remembered how safe he felt, how steady he was, how he listened without question. Years later, when she grew old enough to understand, she would recall pointing her finger and saying the words that gave her courage. But at 3 years old, all she knew was that she was not alone. The retriever, of course, did not know the weight of his role in history. He did not understand verdicts or laws. But he knew the feel of a child leaning closer, the sound of her trembling voice finding strength. And in his quiet, loyal way, he carried on to the next child, and the next, offering the same steady presence, never leaving, always listening. The story spread beyond the courthouse. In time, it reached other courtrooms, other states, other judges who hesitated before dismissing the idea of therapy dogs in trials. It reached law students who studied not just statutes and precedents, but the power of humanity within the law. It reached parents, teachers, and strangers who read about it in newspapers and felt their hearts swell at the thought of innocence finding its voice. For the jurors, the memory never faded. Long after they returned to their ordinary lives, back to offices, farms, classrooms, and families, they would recall sitting in that courtroom when the world went still. They would remember the sound of a child's voice piercing the silence. Some carried it like a quiet flame, reminding themselves that courage was not always loud or grand. Sometimes it was small and trembling and unforgettable. The defense attorney, though he moved on to other cases, carried the lesson as well. He never forgot the futility of trying to argue against the truth of a child's voice. In quiet moments, he admitted to himself that he, too, had been changed by it. And the prosecution attorney, though he won and lost other trials, he argued with skill and fire in countless courtrooms, would always recall that his most powerful witness had not been persuaded by him, but by the gentle thump of a dog's tail on the floor. As for the judge, he never spoke of it in public, never told the story from the bench. But in his private reflections, he carried it as the truest reminder of why justice mattered. Not for the victories, not for the rulings, but for the moments when fear gave way to truth. Years later, when he retired, and people asked him about the most unforgettable case of his career, he would not talk about the biggest trials or the most complex arguments. He would pause, his eyes distant, and say only, "There was once a little girl and a dog." The listeners would wait for more, but often he would stop there, because in those simple words was everything. A child had spoken, a dog had listened, and a courtroom had changed. That was the memory. That was the legacy. And though the trial ended, though the courtroom emptied, though the years moved forward still, in the hearts of all who had been there, the voice of a 3-year-old lingered. Safe dog. It was not just testimony. It was not just evidence. It was a lasting memory.